So, David, we're through 2 months of the year, and we're through a little over a month of the second Trump administration and the 119th Congress. As you think about sort of everything that's happening, um, I'm curious maybe if we start with everything related to lawsuits, the judiciary branch, and particularly executive orders. Let's start there.
Okay, I think that's a great idea, Todd. I think it's a good idea for our listeners to understand kind of what's in play and who the players are. Because I think that's a lot of things are kind of hard to figure out right now, and so it helps people to kind of know. So we both know that and I think our listeners all know that the Trump administration came in with a large number of executive orders, and they were very bold executive orders. That is not unusual for the new president to do. And Biden came in with a whole slew of executive orders, and a lot of them were designed to overturn what the first Trump administration had done. So these are not surprising moves back and forth. Some of them, I think, have been kind of looked like overreach and have made everyone concerned. But the catch is, this is really going to be played out in the federal courts. And that's really what our listeners need to pay attention to and to watch. What is happening at the federal court level? This is where this is all being played out. And so some of the major executive orders that have been put in having to do with hiring freeze, hiring issues and having to do with NIH and budget cuts and things of that nature, those are all working their way through courts, and not just like one federal court. There are several federal courts on each one of the things I just mentioned. They will eventually end up going to, just so everyone knows, you go to a federal court and a federal court judge goes over. Federal court judge does have the ability to place something on temporary restraint and also place it on a more permanent or national restraint. Then the administration will probably appeal. If they lose, they will appeal to, or if the people follow this, they will appeal to whatever appellate circuit that federal court is in. And then the appellate courts then make a decision as to whether or not they're going to uphold whatever the lower court did. Then the next step is the Supreme Court. So most of these things are going to end up at least in the appellate courts, if not in the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court will mostly look to see if there's different rulings going on across the country. And that's when they will take it up. If there's different rulings, if there's unanimity in the other courts, they will probably try to sidestep it. But that's really what we're looking at. And it has everything to do with everything we're talking about. NIH, free firings, hirings, all of these things are all being discussed and determined in the courts. So as people think, well, who's doing what? Well, a lot of people are doing it, but a lot of it is being done also by some of the state attorneys general. So it's a complicated process, and we are going to be following it very carefully. And I think everyone in town is watching this very carefully.
So, two follow-up questions. Let me start with the one that's personal to you. In the past, you worked with the state attorneys general. Can you just give us a sense as to what that group's like in your experience from working with them?
I worked with them for 5 years, and I mostly did a lot of the grassroots work and in the messaging work around their lawsuits against the tobacco companies. And that was specifically what I worked on, the big tobacco lawsuits of the 1990s. Um, so the way they work is that they as a group will look around for issues that they think are really kind of problematic across many states, and they will come together, and then they will start a couple lawsuits, and then they will generally build, and other states will have their own version of that. And it could be a very effective strategy. In the tobacco situation, it was a race to the bonds person, which everyone goes, what? Well, if every state in the country is suing you, and you're like state 22 in order, You go into a court and you say, look, there's 21 states ahead of us. This company may be bankrupt and have no money left by the time it gets to our case. And the court says, okay, we hear you. We're going to set a $10 billion bond for the tobacco industry. They were looking at actually going bankrupt just posting bonds. So it's a very interesting way in which they work. Right now, this is a bit more political. So the AGs that are suing currently are the Democratic AGs. And I would prefer it not to be just one party of AGs, but that's the way it is right now. So that's what's happening. And they do kind of look for things. They took on, if you remember, Microsoft years ago. They've done all kinds of suits of this nature. And they do look for a way to kind of try to make a big reform in their state's area through their cases.
So that gets to my second question, which relates to right now, as you said, it's a politicized process in terms of the state attorneys general. If, and we'll get to potential Medicaid cuts in a second, if there are potential Medicaid cuts, my assumption is that those will be less of a red state, blue state issue and more of an issue around which states are most dependent on the federal part of Medicaid. How does that play out with the attorneys general?
Well, I do want to add one thing here that we don't have just attorneys general. We do have labor unions. We do have other groups. There's always got to be a group that has standing. So some of the stuff around hiring and firings has the main groups that are leading it are like unions, and there are unions within the federal government, like the Treasury Employees Union, which years and years ago, even though I never worked at Treasury, I joined so I could use their bank and their federal and their credit union. Which is, if you're a federal government employee, you can do that. You can go around and to do that. So there's a lot of different groups doing that, but in terms of AGs, I think when you get to Medicaid, I think all bets are off. And we're going to get to Medicaid in a minute. It is definitely not, it does not divide out as evenly between Republican and Democrat as it might have if, let's say, this were 25 years ago. But a lot of things have changed, and Medicaid has grown tremendously, even in the last 5 to 6 years. And there's a lot of it that also has grown in a lot of states that are in political jargon, we would say what are red states, states that went with Trump as opposed to a blue state. So that's kind of one of those things that I think when we get to talking about that, and when you're ready to go over to the budget, that will be a very different situation.
Yeah, so let's use this as an opportunity to shift to the budget. Before I do, I'll just make a comment, which is once things are in the legal system and once they're decided, they're often unpredictable. And as we've talked about before, the current political reality of the court's decision in Chevron is very different today than when that decision was made, in terms of the reliance on the legislative branch to produce to pass legislation that doesn't sort of leave a lot of authority to the secretary and to bureaucrats. And so there's just an interesting sort of dynamic when we think about the judicial branch of the U.S. government. As we shift back to the legislative branch and we talk a little bit about the budget process, I want to start with March 14th. I know it's not quite the Ides of March, but it's close to the Ides of March. And why is that such an important date, March 14th?
Well, I know we're going to have a fun conversation about budget because you and I are both old enough to remember when the budget had a very specific process, and it's changed a little bit, but it's still there. But March 14th is when there was a big package ready to be voted on in December, and there were some back and forth about voting on it. They ended up passing a small continuing resolution that went through March 14th. So March 14th is the day that the government runs out of money. Okay. And that means that if something's not done, then come the next March 14th is a Friday, then the next Monday, the government would be closed. And only people who are essential would be able to work. Non-essentials are not allowed to work. You're not even allowed to go into your office. You're not allowed to do anything because officially the government has not been funded. And and Congress has the ultimate authority to pass those funds, and then the president has to sign them. And without that, there is no money, and the government and they are not able to function. So that's
And
what's
just to, and just to make a point that we've talked a lot about, but I think it's important in this moment in time, there's a difference between entitlement funding and discretionary funding. And with the government shutdown, it affects the agencies that rely on discretionary funding. So the National Institutes of Health, much of the VA. If you think of a really concrete example, March is when there's a lot of spring break throughout the country. So you can imagine the National Park Service shutting down, as opposed to the Medicare program, the Medicaid program, and Social Security, which are entitlement programs and are funded until the government takes away funds or changes how that funding allocates. So just to make that clarification, sorry to interrupt you.
no, 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 no. You're right. That's a good one. That's a good one to make. But I also think you and I talked about the clarification that there's a difference between budgeting and appropriating. So what they're doing now is establishing a budget. So if you think that means all these cuts have been made, they have not. They have made a budget. They have made a budget resolution, and they are trying to pass that along with the Senate joining them, because the House has just done it, but Senate has would have to come along, and they would have to come to an agreement on a budget resolution for that to go to the president. And then the committees in those two those two sections, the House and the Senate, would have to go and figure out the appropriations and make the cuts. So just everyone understand that just because a budget has been voted on does not mean all the cuts have been made or all the increased spending. There are some increases too in the House budget, which has, along lines of like border security and defense. But so there's a lot of difference there. And then what they really want to do is be able to get to something. We won't go into it too much arcane, but something called reconciliation between the budgets, and that's when you get the ability to do something by a single majority. You do not have the ability to filibuster amendments to it or filibuster it in the Senate, and that changes everything.
Yeah, so let's before we get into the math of the House budget resolution, let's talk a little bit just to summarize what you said about the process and where we are in the process, because I think it's really important. So in December, the previous Congress and the previous president agreed to fund the current fiscal year, which goes through the end of September, through March 14th. Currently, Congress needs to decide how they want to fund the government from March 14th through the end of the year. The House of Representatives has passed a resolution, and we'll get into the details of the resolution with a broad outline of tax cuts, spending cuts, and then a few very specific spending increases, as you mentioned, mostly around border security and defense. The Senate now has to do the same. In all likelihood, there'll be differences between those two. And so they'll have to work through, and it's a different definition of reconciliation, but they'll have to reconcile the differences. Once they have something finalized as a resolution, then the committees of jurisdiction will go through and provide specific details around how to implement the tax cuts, the spending increases, and the spending cuts. And so that's sort of where we are in the process. If they're unable to reach agreement, they may do another continuing resolution. I know, David, that's something you've thought about, which is it's possible that they focus less on this fiscal year, which is almost half over, and focus on fiscal year 2026, which starts on October 1st. So let's talk through that first, and then we'll get into the specifics of the resolution.
Sure. Where do you want to start?
So why don't you what's your prediction? Do you think they're going to reach agreement and be able to pass a budget through the end of this fiscal year before March 14th? Or do you think they'll just do kind of a continuing resolution with maybe a few tweaks and cuts, and probably not any tax cuts, but spending cuts perhaps, and maybe some spending increases that offset to get us through the end of September?
Well, we pretty much got the answer from the Speaker Mike Johnson. Okay, so he has indicated they are working on a continuing resolution now. And when I say they, I mean, it's members of Congress. Whether or not Democrats and Republicans are in agreement and on the same place, I doubt that's happened, will be happening right this minute. But there will be probably a continuing resolution. I don't think they can get this all done between now and March. We've got March. We're in March really now. So, there's almost no time left. So that's not surprising. So they will probably do what he, again, Speaker Johnson, what he's indicated is that they would need to do a clean CR. And a clean CR would mean that probably nothing that probably Democrats would like to do to strip Trump of some of the activities that he's done will be included. But then again, nothing that probably Trump has done will be included to make it codified into law. So they will probably do a 6.5 month, CR, which because 6 months will get you to mid-September, and then 2 more weeks will get you to the end of September, get you to the end of the fiscal year. So that's seeming to be the case about what we're going to do. If that is the case, right now, the bet would be that they would extend everything at its current level. So you would not have increases, but you would not have major cuts. So that's kind of what we're looking at the moment.
Yeah, and I think, avoiding a government shutdown, which is always really devastating to the party in power, is probably goal one. So let's work with the assumption that there will be a clean CR through the end of September. That means this budget resolution, this outline is really going to be worked on with the hope of having it go into effect October 1st of this year for fiscal year 2026, recognizing that there are nuances and some things would have to take longer to start on the calendar year, et cetera. But the important part is, as we shift to the sort of third part of our conversation, let's talk a bit about the outlines of the budget resolution. So, can you just describe what the House is thinking of in terms of potential tax cuts, potential spending cuts, and then the few spending increases?
Well, I'm glad you said tax cuts first because I think it's important for people to understand how this is getting shaped. Okay. And the way it's getting shaped is the Trump administration has said to the two Republican caucuses, the Republican caucus in the House and the Republican caucus in the Senate, has said, I want to extend the $4 trillion in tax cuts that we passed in my first administration because they are set to expire. He wants to extend those. So $4 trillion is a lot of money. And then they also 4.5 trillion, so right in there. But then they also want a few other increases, like I said, around defense and around homeland security. So you take that big package, and that it's like, let's say, you want to write a check and you don't have that much money in your checking account. So you've got to move funds from someplace else into your checking account. That's what's going on. So basically what they're saying is, all right, we're going to write this check out for these tax cuts. Then we're going to do some savings by take $2 trillion in spending cuts to pay for those. And that's one thing that's being put on the table. And then we're going to take 2.5 trillion and add it to the deficit. So when they voted on this in the House, there was one Republican defector who did not vote for it, and they probably some more will join him in when they get a little bit further along, because he objected to adding $2.5 trillion to the deficit. So there are going to be some people who are going to be very uncomfortable about the deficit. There are going to be people who are very uncomfortable about the cuts. So this is what ASN is watching, and we are all, like trying to be either as instrumental as we can be, or and are not do anything to like cause trouble for our members and for kidney patients. So we want to kind of keep things going as best we can. But yes, they are battling, and I say this is mostly a battle within the Republican Party in the White House, the Senate, and the House. And since they control all three of those, then they have to come to an agreement because they don't have a margin to overcome any defecting votes. So that's kind of what we're watching. It's a tense situation, and Speaker Johnson is watching it very closely, trying to figure out what things he can do that will be paid, that will get the votes and what things won't. And so that gets us into a lot of discussion about, um, particularly around Medicare and particularly Medicaid, because in the House, in that budget resolution, they gave directions to certain committees to make cuts. And they made a direction to the House Energy and Commerce Committee, a very, very, very powerful committee. And I used to work for a ranking member on that committee. Um, that they have to come up with 880 billion with a B cut dollars in cuts. That's why everyone is concerned about Medicaid. I, just in general, I don't know where they would get $880 billion in cuts without doing that. And so Trump has said he doesn't want Medicaid. President Trump has said he doesn't want Medicaid cuts. Speaker Johnson says he doesn't want Medicaid cuts, but they want them to cut 880 billion. And the math to me seems to be kind of like, I don't know how they do that otherwise. So
Yeah, and just to do sort of the math, and then we can move on because it is early in the process. And I think what's important again is if there is a continuing resolution, then I think things slow a little bit in terms of trying to reach this consensus around this discussion around how do you cut taxes, how do you cut spending, and then also try to get closer to not increasing the deficit. Because one of the things the president would say that he was elected and Republicans taking control of the Senate and maintaining control of the House was around one of the key issues was sort of government spending and the deficit. But if you just do this in percentages, about 60% of the budget is entitlement programs, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, some of the veterans benefits, et cetera. That is a big piece. That's the biggest piece of the spending. 13% is defense, 14% is non-defense spending. So those are both discretionary spending, and they tend to be offset against each other. And then about 13% is interest payments. And so you can do the math pretty quickly that it's impossible to get to this level of spending cuts without looking at entitlement programs, which are very difficult to adjust because of their impact on so many Americans. So I think it's probably reasonable to pause this discussion now. I know we're going to come back to it a lot over the next couple of months and focus specifically to close on the types of things ASN is doing, either specifically within the budget discussion or more broadly around responding to executive orders, responding to directives, um, the Doge effort and some of the issues there. Just can you just give us a quick summary of the types of things we're doing?
sure, sure. For one thing, we have joined with a large swath of healthcare societies, um, medical societies, and talked about and asked for to return to the cuts of the Medicare physician fee schedule that were done in Medicare, which were pretty hefty and which were going to be addressed in the package that would have been passed in December but did not get passed. So we are looking for that to be reinstated and then also to include what we call the Medicare Economic Index, the MEI, to make sure that that is also adjusted because quite frankly, we're looking at a situation where you've been losing money in the physician fee schedule for the last 20 years across the board, and it's really basically not leaving physicians with enough money to actually cover the cost of their practices in private practice. So that's a real concern. So we're pushing on that. There is a lot of bipartisan support for that. Like you said, with all the other number games going on, I don't know exactly, who does what, when, where, but that's one we're working on. And that's pretty important. The other thing that's really, really important is that ASN has joined 600, over 600 medical and scientific organizations, and we are lobbying Congress to prioritize funding at NIH. Okay. And we're not sitting around looking at cuts. We're actually asking for a $1.7 billion increase in funding and continued support in the National Institutes of Health. So There's a lot of people who are with us, and we are all working on that. And we will see exactly, how this all goes as we come about. So it's a, it's kind of, it's quite something to try to figure out where to step, which tune to dance to and which one not to. So it's something that's complicated, but it is taking up. It is priority number one, and priority number one. Everything going on is priority number one, priority number one, priority number one. We hear our listeners and members. We hear you very clearly, and even if we weren't hearing you, we would be concerned for many things as well. So we want to make sure that NIH is well funded. We want to make sure that research does continue, and that we want to make sure that all the things that need to be followed in law are followed, and we want to make sure that physicians and the expense of being a physician are being met in the government. And that's a really big thing. We are also bringing in different members on March 19th to go to Capitol Hill to talk to them about many of these issues, and particularly also a lot of the reforms around the organ procurement and transplant network that were started already. And some of them were started in the Trump administration, and then some of them were funded in last year. The funding is somewhat something we want to make sure is robust enough to continue with the OPT and Modernization Act that was trying to move us forward in transplant to really kind of make a lot of changes that could be very useful and free up the OPTN contract to be used by different contractors. It's a lot going on. So we will be bringing people in, like I said.
I do think it's important that if ASN members or other members of the community want to contact ASN, they absolutely should contact us through either us, you and Lauren, you or me directly, or they can, we do track social media in terms of, people have been raising issues there. But also when we have the Hill Day coming up on March 19th, we will be asking members to contact their individual members of Congress and help support the message that we're trying to deliver on the Hill that day. So there are going to be a lot of opportunities for people to engage. Well, David, you ended with a lot from patient care issues around physician reimbursement to everything that's happening in the transplant arena, to research issues, particularly the situation with NIH, which we probably should perhaps dedicate a focused issue on, because there are some unique things that are happening in NIH that are not happening in other agencies. But we'll save those for the future. So thank you very much, and look forward to continuing to work with you on these issues.
Thank you, Todd.
This podcast is copyrighted by the American Society of Nephrology. All rights reserved. All content in this podcast is for informational purposes only and is not intended to be medical advice. This podcast should not be used in a medical emergency or for the diagnosis or treatment of any medical condition. Please consult your doctor or other qualified healthcare professional if you have any questions about any medical condition, or before taking any drug, changing your diet, or commencing or discontinuing any course of treatment. Thank you for listening to this podcast from the American Society of Nephrology.